Hi, my name is Jim Burnett, and I'm one of the team leads at Shinydocs. I work with most of our major customers, Daimler, CAA, CIBC, Bruce Power, SoCalGas, and I'm here to share some of the lessons learned and best practices that have come out of various projects with those customers and different approaches they've taken to governing and securing file share content. Many of those customers are reviewing their unstructured content infrastructure to determine weak points. One of the governance and security weak points that consistently comes up are file shares and network drives. This new urgency and priority around focusing on file shares and network drive and governance is driven by pending and new privacy and PII legislation, corresponding large fines, and the potential significant reputational damage that can come from a breach. No one wants to be on this slide, and I'm not picking on any of these companies. In actual fact, I'm not highlighting them as being somehow worse than average. They're actually average. They just happen to have had a bad event come up that put them in the news. The reason I'm sharing this slide is because sometimes people think that finding and securing PII in file shares or other repositories is just a simple process of creating a regex and you're done. The challenge that this slide represents is that it's much more complicated and nuanced than that. And there are many aspects of securing PII that you have to be on top of in order to really achieve your governance goals. So if you start on the left-hand side, M&T Bank. M&T Bank actually has a class action lawsuit by some of its customers because they had a data breach, but much of the customer PII that was exposed was for customers who hadn't banked with them for 6 or 7 years. And the customers were outraged. They were like, why on earth do you still have my data if I haven't been a customer of yours in 6 years? And subsequently, they have a class action lawsuit by those customers trying to get to the bottom of why they over-retained their personal data. And if you go to the next example, JP Morgan, they're the opposite. They had a 90-day delete policy on email inboxes, unless the user flagged it as a record. So what happened? Well, users didn't always do that. So they accidentally deleted 47 million emails that they should have been retaining and got a $200 million SEC fine. Nova Scotia was in the process of migrating data from the file shares to a destination repository when they had a breach. Desjardins had their own internal PII governance policy, but they weren't on top of Quebec's new Bill 25, Law 25 for privacy legislation. And so they ran afoul of that new jurisdictional geographic privacy legislation. So this is my point. My point is that if the perception is that all we need is a regex to identify PII and we're done, it's much more complicated than that, and you need a much more thoughtful strategy in order to achieve your governance goals. So let's just go back to why are these customers re-examining their file share and network drives from a governance perspective? Well, no one would argue that unstructured content and sprawl isn't becoming more and more of a challenge every day. It's growing exponentially, right? 500 gigs used to be a lot of data. Then a terabyte was a lot of data. Then 10 terabytes was a lot of data. And that was 50 terabytes. And we have customers that are in the petabyte range in terms of content. And the truth of the matter is that human beings spot checking and looking in on users to see if they're following policy at 50 terabytes is just impossible. And so current tools and current human oversight just isn't adequate anymore to really stay on top of this kind of content growth. And so if you start to ask questions and you say, well, do you know how much content is in the file shares? The answer is, well, we kind of have an idea, but not exactly. And do you know what portion of that content contains PII? What content are users saving in email attachments as PII or Microsoft Teams or in the file shares? Yeah, not really 100% sure about that either. Well, who has access to that content in those file shares in Microsoft? Yeah, we're not exactly sure, right? And the worst part is that the file shares especially have limited meta tagging and search capabilities, so trying to find it is even a bigger challenge. And so the reason that they're looking at all of these different things is they ultimately want stronger governance and security. And so what's the typical approach that customers take to get there? Well, they hit the tipping point where information governance gets too hard using existing tools and processes and human oversight. And they say, okay, what's the solution? Oh, well, we'll just take it out of the less secure file shares and we'll put it in a more secure repository like SharePoint or OneDrive, right? We'll just do a lift and shift. And so the decision gets made to take that approach. And this ultimately oftentimes can be a very disruptive transformation project for the users. And oftentimes the mistake, which we'll talk about later, is that the governance folks say, well, we'll get the users to change their workflow and new policies, and we'll train them on how to use the new UI and how to navigate within the new destination repository. And the problem with that is change management is hard to begin with, but now you're going to ask the users to maybe be less effective and less efficient in their workflow processes. And just simply as part of the transition of that magnitude, moving 10 terabytes or 30 terabytes or 50 terabytes of content is quite an undertaking. So the users start having challenges, and well, I can't find my content in the new repository. It's hard to use the UI in the new repository. So I'm becoming less efficient and less effective in my business objectives. And then it hits the tipping point where the users are saying, okay, I'm not doing this. And they may say that out loud or they may say it privately. And what they'll do is they'll go back to saving it back in the file shares, or if you've shut down the file shares, they'll find a new way to put it somewhere they can find it, like in email folders or in Microsoft Teams folders. And then it's really a challenge because the information governance goals that everybody agreed were a good idea to begin the project with actually aren't achieved, and it's actually worse because some of the content is in the legacy repositories or has even moved to other repositories, and part of it's in the destination repository, and the governance goals of the initial project after putting the users through all that disruption weren't actually achieved. But it doesn't have to be this way. This isn't about this kind of project always ending in that state. It's about the lift and shift approach that causes or has the potential to cause these negative outcomes. So here's the first thing that customers come back to us and say, oh, I wish I had known this or thought this through a little bit more before I began this project. The first fundamental problem that will be faced in projects like this is if you say, okay, we need the users to change their workflows and their approaches and do things that make them less efficient and less effective in order to achieve the governance goals. If the user has to choose between achieving their governance goals, the things that they get measured on, their KPIs for their job performance, and achieving governance, they will always choose the line of business objectives. You will always lose that fight. And so the trick in being successful in these projects is how do you actually make the users more efficient and more effective and make it easier for them to achieve their line of business objectives while achieving your governance goals. And so one of the things that, again, comes up is sometimes IT and governance folks say, oh, well, the users are against, what we're trying to do here. They're actually not. If you ask the users, are you in favor of better built-in governance? Are you in favor of better privacy? Are you in favor of security? Are you in favor of better search? Every single one of them will say, yes, totally support those goals. So it's not that the users are against these kinds of projects. It's the users are often put in a difficult position based on the approach of trying to achieve these business objectives. And so one of the things, again, that comes up from most customers is, I wish I had done a better job in addressing duplicates and older versions and not just lifting and shifting them into the destination repository. The reason for that is, as convoluted or inefficient as the current user's processes, they know how to achieve their goals in that current process. They know where the most current version of something is in their file share. But when you go to do a lift and shift project, what you're actually going to do is you're going to aggregate all the content. There might be 5 different folders where the same document exists under different names, maybe even across different shared drives. And there's going to be obsolete content that's in a different folder again. And what you're going to do is you're going to consolidate all of these different versions and the current version, and you're going to put them into as an aggregated form into the new repository, and then the user can't find anything. Whereas they knew where their one current version was. Now they got 7 versions, 5 duplicates and 2 obsolete versions, and they can't find their stuff and they can't get their day job done. And so immediately you've already made a difficult change management process 10 times harder. And the other thing that many customers have come back to us and said, oh, well, the file shares don't have much in the way of meta tagging capabilities. So we'll just move the content into the destination repositories and then tag it. The problem with that is now you've aggregated all this content, so it's really hard for the user to find their current version, and it's not tagged, and so it makes it even worse to find it. And that's, again, now you've set yourself up to have user adoption challenges. And so part of the process that we'll talk about later is tag it before you put it in and autofill those fields, and now make it easier for the user to find their content. And get rid of the duplicates and the obsolete before you migrate this stuff over. Now, the second thing that happens in a typical lift and shift is you've actually maintained all of the PII in that duplicate and obsolete content that you could have defensively disposed of. Your M&T bank, you're over retaining customer information that now it represents risk to the company with no business value whatsoever. Your surface risk area is now significantly bigger than it needed to be. Most customers find that 30 to 60% of their content is duplicate or obsolete. You could have reduced the surface risk area by 30 to 60%. And you've over-retained it. It's from a retention policy perspective. And now you've made it really complicated to apply retention rules because there's 7 versions of this. Well, maybe you can get rid of the 2 obsolete ones. That's part of the retention. But what about the 5 duplicates? Which one is the most current version? Which one do you retain? Which ones do you get rid of? And so much better to do that on the front end and then have them automatically set up in the destination repository, having the right retention schedule assigned to them. And there's some really straightforward direct costs that you've incurred, right? If you could have gotten rid of 30 or 60% of your content, then you've incurred 30 to 60% more storage and backup costs in the destination repository than you need to, especially important if you're moving from on-prem to the cloud. And the other thing that until you've done a project like this, you don't realize how many exceptions are going to be. And when I say, how many, a really successful IT project in most cases would be, well, 99% of everything went perfectly, and we only had 1% exceptions. But the volume of content really comes into play here, because if you're talking about only moving 10 terabytes of content, well, 1 terabyte represents 1 million records. 10 terabytes is 10 million records. 1% exceptions is 100,000 exceptions that some poor IT team needs to reconcile and resolve. And most of those exceptions could have been gotten in front of quite easily. Special characters in the file names that are too long for the destination repository field that they're going to be filled into, links. If you can proactively mitigate these exceptions. So first of all, if you've reduced the surface risk area by 30 to 60%, you just got rid of 30 to 60% of your exceptions. And if you can proactively mitigate a good portion of the other exceptions, the most common exceptions, you might get that down to only 500 or 1,000 exceptions, which your IT team can reasonably address. And if you don't do that proactively, then what's most likely going to happen is your project timeline and budget is going to be exceeded. Because 100,000 exceptions is a ton for an IT time to get through in a timely manner. And the other issue that many customers don't think about is partial data corruption. So we just worked with an oil and gas company. They moved 50 terabytes of content, not using us, Python scripts, third-party tools, Frankenstein, something together. And they moved 50 terabytes. And as far as the IT team was concerned, it went flawlessly. 100% of the content file names and file sizes matched perfectly. Except it turned out 6% of the content had partial corruption. 3 pages of a 50-page document didn't go across effectively because of some special attributes of those pages. And the worst part was, IT team isn't no human way can they spot check 50 million records, 50 terabytes of content. And so, you know who found it? The users. The user, when they went to go do their day job and found that 3 pages of the 50-page document that they needed to get their day job done was corrupted. And user trust and user adoption got crushed. It's not telling anybody anything they don't already know. It's already hard enough from a change management perspective to get users to make these changes. If things like that happen, you will never get them back. They will go back to saving content in file shares, or if you shut the file shares down, they'll find some other repository. They'll keep it in email folders or in Microsoft Teams, and you will never get them back into the new destination repository. So the all too common outcomes of a lift and shift approach are user trust is at risk. You can lose it, be really hard to get it back. Or the project's even stalled. You get halfway through the project and users show up with pitchforks and torches and say, you can't do this to us anymore. I'm going back to the way I used to do it, or I'm going to find some other way so at least I can know where I can find my content and get my day job done. And your IT costs, your budget gets crushed, right? Because the project takes twice as long or 3 times as long because of these issues. And after all that, the governance goal that was the original objective of the project still doesn't get achieved. But it doesn't have to be this way, right? These are the lessons learned that from these other big customers that I talked about who have gone through this process, who have said, okay, if I was to do it again, what would I do different? So the truth is that there's lots of different ways that you can approach these kinds of projects. You can Frankenstein something. There's lots of tools that will build a content catalog. You can go get your own SHA MD5 hashing algorithms to find duplicates. You can write Python scripts to build a regex to find PII. You can write Python scripts to extract existing access rights, right? But the challenge with that is it's Frankenstein. It's not really well coordinated. It takes a lot of time and developers' effort to do that. Or what you could do instead is you could use the Shinydocs platform. And what we've done is we've just taken all those components and we put them into one easy to deploy, easy to use platform. And so I've got a 2-minute video that I'm going to walk you through that just basically demonstrates that. Right. So basically 15 minutes to install the software. After you've installed the software, all you do is pick the location path of the destination repository that you want to crawl. Push the button. Crawler will be deployed. Start going through the repository. And it'll start creating a content catalog of both the content and the metadata associated with that content. And you'll see here are some of the steps on the left-hand side, the status, right? Creating a content catalog, finding the duplicates, finding the content that has PII. And then what we'll start to do is we'll start to visualize that information for operational execution. So here's your duplicates. Which ones are the cat playing the YouTube video we can dispose of right away? Which ones do we need to have someone review and then make a defensible disposition decision? And so we'll give you the path name. Here's the path exactly to where that content resides. Have the user go review it, make a decision. Do we delete it? Do we put it in a backup path and delete it? Do we put it in cold storage? And here's all the content containing PII. Which pieces of content have a social insurance number or a visa number or a passport number? And where are those files located? And now you can start to do some things that in addition to just the project itself are, well, are users saving things where they're supposed to for the kind of content that is contained in those documents? Are they in the right repository? If the user needs to review it, give them the path they can review it to make a decision about how you're going to secure it. And now you've basically set yourself up for enterprise search because the data is cataloged, it's clean, there's no duplicates. The user can find their content on their first try. And here's the misunderstanding that people have. We'll do search after. No, give the users a search tool right away because you're not going to move 30 terabytes of content on day one. Half will be in the file share, half will be in the destination repository. The user's going to get frustrated. Which repository is the content that I want in? Just give them search. They just put in their criteria, find the document that they want. They don't have to know if it's in the file share or the new destination repository. And now you can schedule all this so that it runs automatically. So every time a new piece of content gets created, it's automatically added to the catalog, automatically deduped, automatically classified and tagged correctly, automatically determined if it contains PII. And you didn't have to Frankenstein anything. You could do it really quickly and easily because all of the components that I talked about earlier that are necessary in order to make this a easier transition, both for the users and the IT team, are you've built your content catalog. You've identified duplicate and obsolete content and defensively disposed of it. You've detected PII and tagged and classified the content correctly. And you've introduced enterprise search right away to make it really easy for the users to find the content that they need during the transition, not just after the transition. I hope you find these lessons learned and best practices from these other customers who have taken on these kinds of projects helpful. My contact information is below if you'd like more information or maybe even your own personalized demonstration.